Amen. You may be seated. Thank you, Jamie. It's good to be with all of you this morning. Little disclaimer: in our home, we've had a bug that's been going through our family. I'm not feeling my best this morning, but I did not want our new discipleship pastor to give his first sermon as a Saturday night special. So, I know you'd be up for the challenge, JD, but. Anyway, so if I slip out after communion, that'll be why. But it's a good reminder to me always that when I'm not feeling like I'm at my best, you know, the power of God's word, it doesn't come from the delivery of a pastor. It comes from the work of the Holy Spirit. So enough said on that, but it's good to be with all of you guys today. If you've been with us for the last month, you know that we've been in this teaching series where we are making our way through the entire storyline of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, and we're doing so through the lens of God's presence. What does it mean to do life in the presence of God, which in the Bible is often associated with the temple or the house of the Lord? And today we come to this story in Genesis chapter 28, which Jamie read for us, a story that is often known as the story of Jacob's ladder. Maybe you have heard that term before. Maybe if you were a kid, you remember taking a little piece of string and weaving it over your fingers to eventually form Jacob's ladder. Or if you were in Sunday school, you took little popsicle sticks and glued them together to make Jacob's ladder. But I'll tell you, in our family, we're not especially big fans of ladders. And not to bring the mood down too much this morning, but you know, the very first funeral service that I ever officiated was actually for my uncle who died by falling off of a ladder. Some of you, I know, were part of the congregation that planted this congregation, Highland Park Pres, in which case you might know a man by the name of Trip Jones, who died a few days ago, and ultimately he died from complications that came from falling off of a ladder. In our house, the way that you get into the attic, you don't have a pull-down ladder. There's no pull-down stairwell. Instead, there's just like a cutout in the ceiling, and so you have to put a ladder underneath that cutout, and you climb up, and then you kind of pull yourself up into the attic, which isn't so bad going up, but it's a little harrowing when you're coming back down, and you've got to make the step back onto the ladder. In fact, when we moved in, we noticed that the prior owners, they left a lot of very meaningful personal things up in the attic, and so we asked them if they wanted them back. They came back, and so she climbs up into the attic, and she's up there for probably an hour and a half, and I finally came in, and I overheard her whispering on her cell phone saying to her husband, "I'm terrified of stepping back down. You've got to come over here. I can't make the jump," which she eventually did, and she safely got back down. But in our family, we have a rule. If one of us, Brandy or I, are going to be on a ladder, well, then we want to be there to spot each other, at least to be in earshot. So if one of us were to fall, we'd be there to respond. So I'll tell you what a wonderful thing it was for me to discover that this is not a story about a ladder at all. I learned that in my preparation for this series. Jacob certainly does not see a ladder in the dream. It's a really bad translation of the Hebrew. He doesn't see kind of an individual ladder as we think of it, but rather as a couple of Hebrew scholars that I really trust, Richard Bauckham, Robert Alter, point out that what he sees is not a ladder. He sees a staircase, like this big, grand staircase, and a staircase almost like a staircase of a temple. So you remember even last Sunday we talked about this in the story of the Tower of Babel, how the people in Babel, the Sumerians, where Jacob's grandfather Abraham was from, what they would do is they would pick out a mountain, and then they would build a staircase up that mountain. They would build a temple up that mountain so that worshipers could kind of climb up the staircase to get to the top of the temple, the mountain, where they would be closer for their worship of God. And what Jacob sees here then is not a ladder. What he sees is this sort of temple staircase. And what I want to suggest to you this morning is that in this little story, in this little scene in Genesis 28, actually we have a picture, we have an image that can help us really to see what the whole storyline of the Bible is all about. We have an image of what it really means for us to be people who can enter into, to experience the presence of God. The story of Jacob's temple staircase, it teaches us really four things. First, it teaches us why we must experience God's presence. Secondly, it teaches us when we are most likely to experience God's presence. Third, it teaches us how we can experience God's presence. And then fourth and finally, where we experience God's presence. So we'll walk through these four together. So first, why we must experience God's presence. And here's the simple answer to that, as we've seen over the last few weeks together. We must experience God's presence because we were made for that, because we were built for that, because we'll be satisfied by nothing less than that. You remember we said earlier on in this series that we were made for intimacy with the infinite one. That's the glory that we had in the Garden of Eden, and that's the glory that we've lost. We were made to live in God's presence. And this is why whatever greatness we experience in life, even if you get to be the gold medal winner in your particular sport or you reach the pinnacle of your field, eventually the luster of that gold is going to fade because we were made for nothing less than to do life in the presence of God. And unless we have that, we're going to look for love in all the wrong places. We're going to look for life in all the wrong places. We're going to find ourselves ultimately unsatisfied because we were made to experience the presence of God. But you know, it's something that you have to experience for yourself. It's not enough to simply know about God. It's not enough to simply believe that there is a God. You have to experience God's presence personally. You have to experience it for yourself. This was certainly true for Jacob. Jacob certainly believed in God. Up until this point in his life, Jacob certainly knew a lot about God, and Jacob's family members had experienced the presence of God. So you remember, Jacob's grandfather was a man by the name of Abraham. Abraham was called a friend of God. He knew the presence of God intimately in his life. God had made tremendous promises to Abraham. He had told him that through him and through his descendants that he was going to launch his mission of redemption in the world. He was ultimately going to create the nation, the people of Israel, through Abraham. He was going to give them the promised land in Israel. God had made incredible promises to Jacob's grandfather Abraham. And no doubt Jacob knew about these promises. But it's one thing to know about God, and it's quite another thing to actually know God, to experience God personally for yourself. There's a big difference between knowing about something and actually knowing something. I'm dating myself a little bit, but maybe some of you remember that movie Good Will Hunting. In which case, maybe you remember that scene where the counselor, Robin Williams, is sitting there with this young man, Matt Damon, who's really intelligent, but he's also troubled. And here's what Robin Williams says to him. He says, you know a lot about art and artists, but do you know what it is like to behold a masterpiece, to be overwhelmed by its beauty? You know a lot about war, but do you know what it is like to hold a dying comrade in your arms? You know a lot about love. You could probably quote a sonnet, but do you know what it is like to be in love and to wholly commit yourself to another person? There's a big difference between knowing about something and actually knowing and experiencing something for yourself. I asked a number of people the question this week. I said, when did you come to know God personally? And I heard a lot of different stories. Great stories, great answers, and they were all different. But something that was consistent in all of them is that they all could point to a moment, to a season, to something in their life where there was this transition where they went from just knowing about God to feeling as if they actually knew God, that they had come to know him personally for themselves. And frankly, friends, we all need that. Jacob needed that in his life. We need that in our lives, to actually experience God's presence. And even if you have experienced God's presence at some point in your past, we long to experience his presence again and again. I'll tell you, one of my fears as a pastor, as I've spent so much time studying and learning about God, reflecting on the scriptures, one of my fears is that my knowledge about God would get in the way of me actually knowing God. Because if I'm honest, there are certainly many times in my life where it seems as if the truths that I know about God, they're not affecting me. They're not permeating my heart. It can be like bullets that are just bouncing off of a rock. They're not really penetrating my heart. I might know that God is with me, but still be very afraid. I might know that I'm completely forgiven in Christ and yet still feel guilty. I might know that God loves me with an infinite love, and yet I'm not satisfied, and I'm looking for that satisfaction somewhere else. Friends, we don't need to just know about God. We need to know God. We need to experience his presence in our lives. And when does that happen for Jacob? When does that happen in his story? Well, look with me at verse 10. We're told Jacob left Beersheba and he set out for a place called Haran. Now, this is about a 500-mile journey. It would have been a very long and difficult journey for any person to take. And I think if Jacob had encountered a stranger on this journey and the stranger had asked him, why are you traveling so far away from your home? Why are you traveling to this place called Haran? Well, Jacob could have given him the answer. He could have said, well, my mother wanted me to go and find a wife from her hometown. Apparently she thinks that's where the best women come from because that's where she's from, so she wants me to go find a wife there. And that would be a true answer. But like many of the answers that we give, it would also be leaving a lot out. It would be leaving out a lot of the family conflict, the family shame, the family drama that was actually precipitating this journey for Jacob. If you know any of Jacob's backstory, then you know that Jacob was a twin, that he and his brother Esau were twin brothers, and Esau was born first and Jacob second, but a prophecy was given to his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, that even though in those days all inheritance would go through the firstborn son, this prophecy was given that actually one day the older son, Esau, would serve the younger son, Jacob. That God's blessing would go through Jacob and his family line, not through Esau. And yet, Jacob's father, Isaac, preferred his brother Esau. He loved his brother Esau. He connected with his brother Esau. Esau was a man's man. He was a hunter. And his father Isaac loved and favored Esau. And he ignored Jacob. And I think all of us, we know what effect that would have on a boy's heart to grow up longing for that approval from his father, but not getting it, the lack of security and significance that would come from just longing to have his father's blessing and attention. And finally, one point, there came a moment where Jacob and his mother, who favored Jacob, they had this plan. They hatched this idea. They knew that God was ultimately going to work through Jacob and his line, but they didn't want to trust God's timing. They wanted to take things into their own hands, and so they schemed and they plotted for how Jacob could get his father's blessing. And so Jacob dressed up, pretended to be his brother Esau, so that he could go into his father on his deathbed and so that he could receive his father's blessing. But of course, when Esau, his brother, finds out about this, he wants to kill him. And so why is Jacob on this journey? Well, he's on this journey in search of a wife, but more so because he's fleeing for his life. And so here's Jacob going out into the world, leaving his home, leaving his family, leaving everything he has ever known, and he is utterly alone in the world. He is on his own, he has no one, and he has nothing. If you know anything about his father Isaac, there was a time Isaac went to look for a wife, And he had a huge dowry to bring with him, to persuade a woman to marry him with great expensive gifts. But Jacob doesn't have that. In fact, you look at verse 11, look what it says. It says, taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. Now, I am not a great outdoorsman. I have only camped a few times and slept on the ground, but I'll tell you what, I have never slept with a stone or a rock for my pillow. Why? Because if you have anything else, if you have some socks, if you have, a sweatshirt, if you have a backpack, you're going to put your head on that. You're not going to sleep on a rock. The only reason Jacob here is sleeping with his head on a stone is because he has nothing else. He has no one and he has nothing, and he is at an absolute low point in his life. And yet this is the moment. This is the moment where God reveals himself to Jacob. This is the moment when Jacob experiences God's presence really for the first time in his life. And I would suggest to you, this is the way that God often works in our lives. That often these are the moments when we're most likely to experience God's presence. It's actually in hardship. It's in trials. It's in pain. It's in some form of suffering. C.S. Lewis was no stranger to pain and to loss in his life. And he once put it this way. He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our consciences. But he shouts to us in our pains. He said, pain is like God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. I was thinking back for myself. I was thinking that on a season of pain and loss about a year ago in my life when my dad died and my friend Brian died. And I remember talking to this woman shortly thereafter, and she said, how are you doing? And I remember saying to her, I said, I'm sad. I don't know that I've been sadder before. I felt overwhelmed at the time as we were getting ready to welcome our second son. And yet I said to her, it's strange because in a way, I feel closer to Jesus. I feel his nearness in my life more than maybe I've ever felt his nearness before. I remember this lady, she looked at me like I was nuts. Like I was crazy. And she said as much. She was like, I have no idea what you are talking about. And maybe it's something that you have to experience more than you can explain. Maybe that's true to some of your stories and your experience. Maybe there's been a difficult season in your life and in which you really felt and you really sensed the presence of God with you. And I don't know fully why it works like that. Maybe in good times, we just find ourselves so distracted or so preoccupied with other things or so full of pride and self-sufficiency. But there's a very real way in which we're actually more likely to experience God's presence in our lives, in our low points, in our trials. That's certainly the case here for Jacob. He's at the lowest point of his life, and that's when he experiences God's presence with him. And how does that happen? How does he actually experience God's presence in this scene? And I guess you could say, well, formally, it's through a dream, right? That's how it happens, through this dream that he has. And God, I think, still does reveal himself to people through dreams today. I've shared this story before of a friend of mine named UJ, who was from Turkey, and UJ was a Muslim trying to convert people to Islam when he had a dream. And he encountered Jesus, and he ended up becoming a Christian, and now he's a Christian pastor in Turkey. God still reveals himself to people through dreams, but I think what matters here is actually less the form, the dream, and more what Jacob sees in the dream. And so what does Jacob see in his dream? He doesn't see a ladder, we've made that clear, but he sees a staircase, this massive staircase connecting heaven to earth. And he sees angels who are going up and down this staircase. I don't know how many, dozens or hundreds or thousands of angels going up and down this staircase. But you know what was most shocking, what had to be most surprising that Jacob sees is he sees God. But where is God? He's not standing up at the top of the staircase. What Jacob says is actually there is God standing over him, like right there with him, where he's lying on the ground. So that Jacob says, surely God is in this place. He doesn't look and see God at the top of the staircase. No, instead, he sees God standing right there with him at the bottom, as if God has come down the staircase to stand right there next to him. And then to speak these words of intimate promise to him. God says to him, effectively, he says, Jacob, I know that right now you feel incredibly alone. But God promises him, he says, I will be with you. Wherever you go, I will watch over you. He says, Jacob, I know maybe right now you don't have anything to your name, but I'm going to give you the inheritance. I'm going to give you the land that I promised to your grandfather Abraham. Jacob, even though right now it may not look like I'm doing anything in your life, I am. I'm working things out for your good. I have a plan for you. God speaks these promises to Jacob, not from the top of the staircase, not from up in heaven, but actually right down at the base of the staircase. He speaks these promises to him, which means, I don't know if any of you are Led Zeppelin fans, but if you are, Led Zeppelin gets the title wrong. This is not a staircase to heaven, but actually this is a staircase from heaven. That Jacob doesn't ascend. He doesn't go up the steps to get to God up in heaven. No, rather, this is a God who graciously comes down to Jacob. And you think about this even just in the way that God chooses to come to Jacob in the moment he comes to him, like Jacob isn't even looking for God. He's not even seeking to encounter God. And Jacob has just made a complete mess of his life through his lies, through his deceit, through his deception, and yet God graciously comes down to Jacob. And I think, friends, this is where the storyline of the Bible is so different than every other religion. The God that we meet in the story of the Bible is so different from the God of every religion, as we said last Sunday, because in every other religion, it's ultimately about how do we climb up to God. Maybe it's the eightfold path in Buddhism. Maybe it's the 5 pillars of Islam. Maybe it's even the 10 commandments. Here are the steps. Here are the things you need to do to be good enough for God, to be holy enough for God, to make your way up to God. But instead, what Jacob sees is this God who comes down to him in his grace, which means that if you're going to experience God's presence, the only way to do so is when you come to him on the basis of his grace. And I know that some of you, that's true in your story. I think about one woman in our church who, in her new member testimony, she shared that she grew up in the church. She grew up around Christianity. She grew up reading her Bible. If you had asked her at that stage in her life, are you a Christian? She would have said absolutely yes. But if you were to ask her later, was she a Christian back then? She would say no, absolutely not. Why? Because she didn't yet understand God's grace. She was still trying to make herself good enough for God. She was still trying to climb her way up to God. It wasn't until a friend of hers explained to her that you'll never be good enough for God. Admit that. Stop trying to climb up to God and instead transfer your trust to Jesus who came down for you. Put your faith in him and relate to God not on the basis of your goodness, but relate to him on the basis of his grace for you in Jesus. And that's, I think, what Jacob sees here. That's what he recognizes in this staircase. And by the way, if you think I'm reading too much into this image, then take it from the words of Jesus himself. You know, there's a scene in John chapter 1 where Jesus is talking to this guy by the name of Nathanael, and Nathanael has just become a disciple, and he's amazed because Jesus knew something about him that nobody else could have known. And you know what Jesus says to Nathanael? He says, Nathanael, you're going to see greater things than this. He says, I tell you truly, you are going to see heaven open up, and you're going to see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, clearly, this is a reference back to this story, this dream that Jacob had. But notice what Jesus is saying here. This is incredible. Jesus says, you're going to see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Which means what? Which means Jesus is saying, look, you disciples, you correspond to Jacob. You're those who see the vision. But then Jesus is saying that he corresponds to what in the dream? To the staircase. Angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Jesus is saying, look, I am the staircase that Jacob saw. I'm the one. My very person, my very self who links heaven to earth. Jesus didn't come to show us the staircase by which to climb up to God. Jesus says, I came to be the staircase. I came to be the way and the truth and the life. I came to be the way through which you relate to God, not on the basis of your climbing, but on the basis of grace. And here's the thing, friends. Maybe some of you have experienced that grace. You know what it is to come to God on the basis of his grace. Just like Jacob is learning in this story. But even when you do that, even when you start to relate to God in that way, it doesn't mean that your life is immediately going to be fully transformed. So Jacob has this experience of God, and he, I think, learns something of God's grace as God comes down and condescends to make these promises of unconditional love to him. And yet look at how Jacob responds. It's not a great response. You think about it, God comes and says unconditionally, Jacob, I love you. Here's what I'm going to do for you. Are there any ifs? Are there any conditions? No. God makes these unconditional promises to Jacob, and then what does Jacob do? He says, okay, God, I'll follow you if you will do these things for me, if you will protect me, if you will look out for me. He's still dealing with God. He's still negotiating with God. He's not unconditionally surrendering to God. And then later, if you know anything more of Jacob's life, when he gets into trouble, what does he do? He lies. He schemes. He deceives. Old habits die pretty hard. And maybe for some of us in this room today, maybe you've been a Christian for a long time. I don't know about you, but sometimes I have the thought to myself, God, as much as I have learned about you, or as much as you have revealed yourself to me, I ought to be further along than I am. I ought to be more holy than I am. I ought to be more loving than I am. I ought to be less selfish than I am. And I think you could look at this in Jacob's life, though, and just be encouraged with the fact that sanctification, it's gradual. It's slow. Which is why you don't just come to God once for his grace. You continue to come back to him. The only way to relate to God is to come back to him again and again on the basis of his grace. The way that we experience God, how we experience God, is on the basis of his grace. But then finally, where? Where do we experience God's presence? And we'll end with this question. Jacob has this dream, and God says to him, Jacob, I will be with you wherever you go. And from this promise, I think Jacob grasps that God is not just with him in that particular place in Bethel, but that now God's going to be with him in every place. That wherever he goes, in a way, is going to be a Bethel. It's going to be a house of the Lord. That wherever he is, God is going to now be present with him. And he confirms that, even if you know the rest of Jacob's story. Later on in Jacob's life, when he comes back to the promised land 14 years later, Jacob says, God has been with me wherever I have gone. Then later, when he's going to go down to Egypt to be reunited with his son Joseph, whom he thought was dead, God comes to him in a dream and he says, I myself will go down with you to Egypt. And then at the end of Jacob's life, as he's getting ready to die, he says these words, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. And that for some of us, sounds a lot like Psalm 23. This God who is with us, even in the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. Jacob's come to understand what is really the greatest privilege that any human being can discover, that God is personally with him. He's with him. It doesn't just mean that God is omnipresent. It means that God loves him, that God favors him, that God has befriended him. He knows what it is that God is with him, so that whatever place he is in, wherever he is, God's with him wherever he goes. That's very true, and it's all the more so true, by the way, for us who live much later in the biblical storyline, because now we who have trusted in Jesus, if you've put your faith in Jesus, now the Holy Spirit himself, the Spirit of God, has come to dwell within you, to take up residence in your life, which means we can be assured that no matter where we are, no matter where we go, no matter what the conditions of our lives, no matter if we can tell what God is up to or not, no matter if we can even feel or sense his presence with us or not, we can be absolutely assured that God is with us wherever we go. Jacob begins to grasp this. And yet, even as Jacob realizes that God is now going to be with him in every place, there's also still this sense that Jacob seems to think that God is uniquely present in that particular place. That place, you remember, what does he do after he has this dream there? He sets up a pillar with a stone, and he calls it the house of the Lord. He says, surely this is the house of the Lord. This is the gate of heaven. He changes the name of that place to Bethel. He has this sense that God is like uniquely in that place. And if you know the rest of the storyline of the Bible, actually 3 times later, Jacob comes back to Bethel to worship and to set up an altar there. And that later, this would be the place where the tabernacle would be located during the time of the judges. This is the place where the Ark of the Covenant would be located. There's a unique way in which God is present in that particular place, which I think is maybe in part almost as if God, like a mountain climber, who climbs up to a mountain, and they put the flag of their country as a way of like saying this mountain in a way like belongs to our country. It's almost as if here in this moment in the storyline of the Bible, God is like putting down a flag there in Bethel, as if to say, from this place, I'm going to launch this mission to one day reclaim the entire place, to reclaim the entire world, this world that God created good, but which has fallen into sin. It's almost as if God is saying, one day, this, not just this particular place, Bethel, but the whole world is going to be filled with my presence. And that's the end of the storyline of the Bible, isn't it? When heaven comes down to earth, when the whole world becomes a temple, the whole world becomes a sanctuary of God's presence. But I also think it's through this particular place that Jacob and his family and his descendants, whenever they're feeling far from God, there's something about that physical place, just like the later temples, where they can come and they can be reassured that God is with them. And I think about, what does that mean for us today? I think in a sense that actually might be true of this place. You think about a sanctuary, you think about a church, the church is not just the place and the building, it's the people primarily. But I think there's a way in which when we come into this place, we worship together, there is a way that God uses a physical place to reassure us that he is present with us. But even more so, I'm certain of this, that is all the more so true when we come to the Lord's table. That is a place where God reassures us of his presence in a tangible way, in a physical sort of way. That is the place, whenever we come to the Lord's table, where God assures us that he is gracious towards us in Jesus. He assures us that he wants to commune with us, that he wants to be with us wherever we go. And so let's pray as we come to the Lord's table together this morning. Father, we acknowledge that you made us for nothing less than intimacy with the infinite one. That God, even when we don't realize it, even when we're chasing after it in some other form or some other place, Lord, that what our hearts need and long for the most is to experience your presence. Father, I pray that we would recognize that maybe it's in the difficulties, maybe it's in the valleys, Lord, maybe it's in the challenges of our lives that you want to reveal yourself to us. And Lord, I pray that if there's anybody here this morning, Lord, that's in a valley right now, they're in a dark spot, Lord, would you help them to, instead of getting angry with you, shaking their fist at you, just trying to fix things or overcome those problems on their own, Lord, would you help them? Would you help us to be open to the fact that maybe it's in those difficulties that you want to meet us, that you want to reveal yourself to us, just as you did to Jacob. And Father, we thank you that you are a God who doesn't wait for us to ascend the stairway up to you, to work our way up to you, but that you come down to us. And you speak to us promises of your unconditional love and grace. Would you remind us of that at this table this morning? Lord, and as we come to this table, would you assure our hearts afresh that you are the God who goes with us wherever we go? We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. Well, friends, on the night that our Lord Jesus was betrayed, he gathered with his